All right, let's get started. All right, so after these 2 weeks, last week and this week, of sort of Marxism, then we're going to start getting into the cultural criticism that follows from this kind of mold. And we'll find this sort of an abiding theme for the next several weeks, and including when we get into the postmodernism. So next week is basically the question of mass culture, mass society, 20th century mass culture, mass society, mass politics. We're sort of approaching the latter subject, mass politics, this week, but we're going to get into it as a cultural phenomenon next week. So Siegfried Krakauer, his two essays, The Mass Ornament and Photography. Then Walter Benjamin's Little History of Photography, which is a follow-up to Krakauer's essay on photography. They're friends, they're acquaintances, and so he takes up on a suggestion from Krakauer to write his essay. And then we'll look at a couple of short pieces by Benjamin, or a few, Experience in Poverty, On the Mimetic Faculty, and The Proletarian. We'll do music the following week, and then we'll come back around to the question of modernism in the 20th century with Greenberg. Okay, so volunteers for next time. I'd say, in short, photography is going to be our topic for next time, but more than just photography. Our mass culture is beginning to. Okay, you guys? All right, great, thank you. Okay, all right, so let's get into what we had for today. All right, so we have two posts of Gabe and Nyla. And Nyla is okay. All right, so let's start with something that I think that I've raised previously, but it bears repeating or reminding. So the timeline that we're operating on, and we're going to go forward on the timeline, and then we're going to go backward on the timeline. But we're dealing essentially with now the middle of the 19th century. We did basically Marx, and we also had reference of what we're going to turn to this, Baudelaire, and modernism as a circa 1848 phenomenon after the 1830s and 1840s. After a boom bust cycle of the first industrial revolution. So the first industrial revolution as a circa 1750 to 1850 phenomenon. So the rise of capitalism per se. Now we're going to get into later historical period. So we talked about this period as the emergence of modernism. Now we're going to get into high modernism era. We'll return to this. But really what distinguishes it, this era of 1870, 71 to 1914, is the second industrial revolution. Whereas the first industrial revolution was centered on the UK France, and the Benelux countries. So France and the Benelux countries after the French Revolution, starting in the UK, France and the Benelux countries. The Second Industrial Revolution has its center in the US, Germany, Japan, and Italy and Russia. China, right-sized board, right-oriented board, whiteboard. And this is the period of the Belle Epoque. Or the Gilded Age. It's also the period, if this is the period 1848 to 1870 circa, of Marx and modernism. This high modernism period is the period of Marxism. There's a distinction to be made between Marx and Marxism. It's when Marxism went from being basically the thought of two people, Marx and Engels, to becoming the ideological current of a mass movement, Marxism. And so the Second Industrial Revolution is the period also of the Second International. So that's the Socialist International, which also has its major parties are in Germany, Russia, Italy, the United States. So there are Second International parties elsewhere, like in France and Amsterdam and Belgium, in the Netherlands and Belgium. Less so in England, ironically enough, considering that's the first industrial revolution country. The Second International, or the Socialist International, is in the Second Industrial Revolution countries. That's where Marxism had the most influence, especially Germany. We'll be talking about that today in particular. Okay, the First International, since there's a Second International, the First International was formed in an earlier period, before and during that era of the Franco-Prussian War and the Paris Commune. And it fell apart. It was a conflict between the Marxists and the anarchists that destroyed the First International. And then the Second International was just Marxist. So this period of Marxism corresponds to the period of the Second Industrial Revolution, high modernism, and really built itself up and developed in the period leading up to World War I. And then World War I was the crisis of the Second International, crisis of Marxism. And there were both the war itself and the revolutions that came at the end of the war divided the Second International. And then there was a Third International. So the Second International was the Socialist International, and then the Third International was the Communist International. And the Third International, the Communist International, was wound down by Stalin during World War II. But the Second International still exists. There's still a Socialist International that still exists. They are the social democratic parties in the world belong to the Second International, the Socialist International.
When you say international, you just mean movement that was going on at the time?
No, it's actually a body of people, like it's an organized body of people. They had congresses, they had delegates, they had a whole process like voting. Basically the different parties saw themselves as members of a world party for socialism. And they thought of themselves as being a government in waiting to take over the world in a socialist revolution. So they were, but then they were supposed to do that. They were supposed to stop an international war and turn it into a class war and a socialist revolution in World War I. But instead, they basically, the French and German parties particularly, lined up with their respective governments. So they both out of self-defense. So because the Germans attacked the French, then the French Socialist Party was like, we have to support our government to defend ourselves against the German militarists. And then also because France and Russia were allies, when Germany attacked France, Russia attacked Germany, and so then the German socialists are like, we have to defend our government against the Russian invasion. So it was a kind of a disaster, and the Second International fell apart. And there were some parties that in the Second International that maintained that they should be opposed to an international war and be instead for a class war and socialist revolution. That was the Italian party and the Russian party and the American party stood for that. But the French party and the German party, and since they're the major kind of combatants in World War I, betrayed the Second International. So we read for today Rosa Luxemburg, and this is her point. Her point is the betrayal of socialism by her party, the German party, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which still exists, right? So that's a party that is in and out of government in Germany. Right, so we have, now the Christian Democrats are in power, but before that there was a SPD government, like last year or something. So they renounced Marxism in the late 50s, officially. Of course, to Rosa Luxemburg, they renounced Marxism in 1914. And also to Lenin and others, they renounced Marxism. So the Third Communist International, we read Lukács last week. So Lukács was a member of the Hungarian Communist Party, and there was a Hungarian revolution at the end of World War I. There was a breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he was a commissar of culture in the Hungarian Workers' Republic, short-lived in 1919. So he's a member of the Communist International. Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin are the big leaders of the Communist International, coming out of the breakup of the Second International. So there's a Russian Communist Party, the Bolsheviks, and there's a German Communist Party, which is the Spartacus Bund. And they form the core of the new Third International, the Communist International. And there were other parties. There was the French Communist Party, the American Communist Party, there were a British, UK Communist Party. So now, what else do I want to say about this? Okay, so the distinction between socialism and communism that we're familiar with, it originates from this time. So that was not a distinction that was made by Marx and Engels or by people in the 19th century. It's a 20th century distinction. And it basically comes down to, did you support the Russian Revolution or not? Did you support specifically the Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917? If you support them, then you're a communist. If you don't, then you're a socialist. Otherwise, those two words have different, they have another distinction in terms of their meaning, but that's not what we know of today. So communists stand for violent revolution, and socialists stand for electoral, peaceful reforms of capitalism in the direction of socialism. Okay, what else did we read today in terms of the how this all plays out? Okay, so that's the essential historical era. There's of course a later historical era. Namely, these revolutions happened in Russia, Germany, Hungary. There's also an uprising in Italy, and that will be important when we deal with fascism. but it's only successful, or the communists only retain power in Russia. Elsewhere, the revolutions are defeated, and we barely even talk about them. We don't really talk about the German Revolution of 1918, 1919, even though it gave birth to the Weimar Republic. Right? It did put an end to the Prussian Empire, the Kaiser Reich, and replaced it with the Federal Republic, which is still what Germany is, the Bundesrepublic, the Weimar Republic. Now, there's a consolidation of capitalism, a restoration after World War I, after that disaster, really led by Woodrow Wilson, the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations, even though the Republicans, who were the dominant party in the United States, voted against ratifying and prevented the U.S. from entering into the League of Nations. Still, that system was established by the United States. And it was Wilson's peace or Lenin's peace, meaning is the world going to go back to capitalism under American leadership, or is the world going to go on to communism under Lenin's leadership? So obviously the latter didn't really happen. And then the Great Depression hit, and there was a post-war recovery, the Roaring 20s. If you've heard of the Roaring 20s, the Roaring 20s are the post-World War I economic boom. The flappers, right? There's a kind of a sexual revolution. There's loosening of sexual morals. American soldiers come back from serving in France, having learned the French way. What does that mean? It means that they like blowjobs. And there's a moral panic about that. American men are corrupted by their European experience. So the flappers, the Roaring 20s, right? Great Depression at the end of the 20s. So the Wall Street financial crash at the end of the 20s, which is a world crisis, and it takes a specific form. So that form is the Versailles Treaty, the post-war settlement, was to hold Germany responsible for the war, so they owed reparations to the British and the French. The British and the French had bankrupted themselves, basically through the war, and they had been propped up financially by the United States during the war, before the US entered the war late in 1917. And so the Germans had to pay the French and the British, and the French and the British had to pay the Americans. And the Americans are like, oh, none of that's going to happen unless we loan money to the Germans so that they can pay the British and the French, so that the British and the French can pay us back. And that was the system until the Wall Street crash meant that they couldn't give money to the Germans to give to the British and the French to give back to the Americans. So the whole thing fell apart. And you got the Great Depression. What we'll be dealing with today with Wilhelm Reich is this idea that both social democrats and the communists, both wings of Marxism, expected the Great Depression to renew the struggle for socialism, and in the communist case to lead to a socialist revolution in Germany, but also elsewhere. Instead, what happened was fascism. Fascism took advantage of the crisis of the Great Depression. They were the beneficiaries, not the socialists, not the Marxists. But we'll get there. All right, so this is just to lay out the overall picture. The Soviet Union, which continued to exist through the 1920s, of course, survived after the revolution. It had opened itself up to trade and foreign investment in the 1920s under the new economic policy, but of course that dried up with the Great Depression. And so the Soviet Union had to take a different route. They had to do the 5-year plan, which was a crash industrialization program and a collectivization of agriculture between 1928 and 1933. It was a disaster. Mass starvation of peasants and a lot of political repression attached to that. Trotsky, who we read also, he was part of the Communist Party in the Russian Revolution. He was the co-leader in the revolution with Lenin. So in the world, people would refer to Lenin and Trotsky, and also Rosa Luxemburg, these communists. He was kicked out of the Soviet Union in 1928 when the crisis hit. And he was a critic of Stalin and of Stalin's leadership, or what he considered to be his misleadership in the Soviet Union. He's a critic of the 5-year plan, critic of the declaration that happened later by Stalin that the Soviet Union had achieved socialism. And then they had the purges to deal with the crisis, ongoing crisis of the 1930s in the Soviet Union, in which basically 90% of the surviving people from the party in 1917 were killed. And then eventually Trotsky also was killed in exile in Mexico. The purge trials were a big deal, and the communist parties throughout the world had to go along with this because they were aligned with the Soviet Union and they had to sort of support this. And Trotsky tried to start a fourth international in 1938 after the purges. So he tried to renew the global socialist communist movement out of the failures of the second and third internationals, and in the face of Stalinism, which was extremely repressive. And took a conservative turn in communist policy and in Marxism throughout the world. So for instance, as an example, the Soviet Union liberalized marriage and divorce, decriminalized homosexuality, decriminalized abortion. All these things were rolled back by Stalin in the 30s. And then the official line of Marxism was anti-homosexuality, the family, the traditional heterosexual family as the fighting unit of socialism, and motherhood as the duty of women in socialism. So total conservative turn, but rationalized with Marxism. And why did they have the policies that they had originally? Because that was the policy from Marxism before World War I, and it was also the socialist communist movement. Generally, the anarchists, the socialists, everybody supported gender equality. A lot of them call for abolition of the family, reproductive freedom, and decriminalization of deviant sexual practices. That was just, they were 19th century kind of liberals in that way. But then we had a kind of conservative turn, extremely conservative turn in Marxism, starting in the 1930s, that only changed in the 60s with the New Left. So huge changes, and that's what Trotsky is speaking to. So we have high modernism, and what we're going to be getting into a little bit, but more so in coming weeks, is the fragmentation of modernism in World War I. So the fragmentation of modernism into the 20th century avant-garde. So Dadaism is the exemplar of that in World War I. A late modernism after World War I. Mass culture in a new way, similar to the 19th century, but with a kind of broader spread after World War I. And also political art. So communist art, fascist art, official liberal democratic art, like in the United States during the Great Depression, the Works Progress Administration, fascist art I mentioned. In the Soviet Union, socialist realism. Socialist realism is the official style, and the suppression of modernism. So including like killing artists who were modernists for their formalism and their individualism and their antisocial practices as artists. So they were censored, and if that didn't work, jailed, and if that didn't work, killed. And like I said, this is the official line for communist parties throughout the world. So throughout the world, all the communist parties become anti-modernist officially, and socialist realist officially. And the communist parties are big, influential parties in many countries. in the United States, in France, in Britain. So they have an influence. Okay, so Rosa Luxemburg, let's look at her piece. So this is known as the Junius pamphlet. It was written under a pseudonym, Junius, when Rosa Luxemburg was in prison for opposing the war in Germany. So smuggled out in 1915, the crisis of German social democracy. And we just looked at the very first, so it's like a pamphlet, and then it has like several sections. We looked at the first part. We had a preamble part. Okay, so let's see what she has to say. The scene has changed fundamentally. The 6 weeks march to Paris has grown into a world drama. Now, what is that about? Well, the Germans, the Prussians, expected to repeat what they had done in the Franco-Prussian War, which was defeat France within a few weeks, occupy France. That doesn't happen. So they went for like what's later called the Blitzkrieg. Right, they did that successfully in 1870-71. They tried it again in 1914. It didn't work. Hitler did do it successfully in 1940. So instead it became trench warfare, which no one was prepared for. And we've had a repeat performance of that recently. Putin expects to knock out the government in Ukraine in short order, but instead it's bogged down into a trench warfare, war of attrition. Right, so, and now it's just about that war of attrition, like draining both sides, kind of trying to bleed each other to death. But obviously, Russia's at the disadvantage. Okay, mass slaughter has become the tiresome and monotonous business of the day, and the end is no closer. Bourgeois statecraft is held fast in its own vice. The spirit summoned up can no longer be exercised. So this is a little bit of a echo of the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels, where they use the image of the sorcerer's apprentice. Right, the sorcerer's apprentice who calls up powers that he can't control. Right, that's what capitalism is. Capitalism is the unleashing of forces that we can't control. Gone is the euphoria. Gone the patriotic noise in the streets, the chase after the gold-colored automobile, one false telegram after another, the wells poisoned by cholera, the Russian students heaving bombs over every railway bridge in Berlin, the French airplanes over Nuremberg, the spy-hunting public run amok in the streets, the swaying crowds in the coffee shops with ear-deafening patriotic songs surging ever higher, whole city neighborhoods transformed into mobs, ready to denounce, to mistreat women, to shout hurrah, and to induce delirium in themselves by means of wild rumors. Gone too is the atmosphere of ritual murder, the Kishinev air where the crossing guard is the only remaining representative of humanity, of human dignity. The spectacle is over. German scholars, those stumbling lemurs, have been whistled off the stage long ago. Trains full of reservists are no longer accompanied by virgins fainting from pure jubilation. They no longer greet the people from the windows of the train with joyous smiles. Carrying their packs, they quietly trot along the streets where the public goes about its daily business with aggrieved visages. The prosaic atmosphere of pale day, in the prosaic atmosphere of pale day, there sounds a different chorus, the hoarse cries of the vulture and the hyenas in the battlefield. 10,000 tarpaulins guaranteed up to regulations, 100,000 kilos of bacon, cocoa powder, coffee substitute, cash on delivery, immediate delivery, hand grenades, lathes, cartridge pouches, marriage bureaus for widows of the fallen, leather belts, jobbers for war orders, serious offers only. The cannon fodder loaded onto trains in August and September is moldering in the killing fields in Belgium, the Vosges, the Masurian lakes where the profits are springing up like weeds. It's a question of getting the harvest into the barn quickly. Across the ocean stretch thousands of greedy hands to snatch it up. That's the Americans who are profiting off the war. Business thrives in the ruins. Cities become piles of ruins. Villages become cemeteries. Countries, deserts. Populations are beggared. Churches, horse stalls. International law, treaties, and alliances. The most sacred words and the highest authority have been torn in shreds. Every sovereign, by the grace of God, is called a rogue and lying scoundrel by his cousin on the other side. And they literally were cousins, the different kings of Europe. all related to Queen Victoria, basically, in the preceding century. Every diplomat is a cunning rascal to his colleagues in the other party. Every government sees every other as dooming its own people and worthy only of universal contempt. There are food riots in Venice and Lisbon, Moscow, Singapore. There is plague in Russia and misery and despair everywhere. So it is an actual world war. It is, as much as World War II. So for instance, in World War I, the French have huge contingents of African troops. The British have huge contingents of Indian troops. They can't fight the war without African and Indian troops. Can't do it. Later, after the war, the French occupied the Ruhr, which is a coal mining and industrial part of Germany, in order to guarantee the reparations are paid. They occupy it with African troops. And this is one of the rallying cries of the Nazis, is the offense of having African troops stationed occupying Germany. And the first people the Nazis kill when they take power are the children born of the African troops in German women, because of course there were many. Violated, dishonored, wading in blood, dripping filth, there stands bourgeois society. This is it, in reality. Not all spick and span and moral with pretense to culture, philosophy, ethics, order, peace, and the rule of law. But the ravening beast, the witch's Sabbath of anarchy, a plague on to culture and humanity, thus it reveals itself in its true, its naked form. In the midst of this witch's Sabbath, a catastrophe of world historical proportions has happened. The international social democracy has capitulated. To deceive ourselves about it, to cover it up, would be the most foolish, the most fatal thing the proletariat could do. Marx says, the Democrat, that is, the petty bourgeois revolutionary, comes out of the most shameful defeats, as unmarked as he naively went into them. He comes away with the newly gained conviction that he must be victorious. Not that he or his party ought to give up the old principles, but that conditions ought to accommodate him. The modern proletariat comes out of historical tests differently. Its tasks and its errors are both gigantic. No prescription, no schema valid for every case, no infallible leader to show it the path to follow. Historical experience is its only schoolmistress. Its thorny way to self-emancipation is paved not only with immeasurable suffering, but also with countless errors. The aim of its journey, its emancipation depends on this, is whether the proletariat can learn from its own errors. Self-criticism, remorseless, cruel, and going to the core of things is the life's breath and light of the proletarian movement. The fall of the socialist proletariat in the present world war is unprecedented. It is a misfortune for humanity. But socialism will be lost only if the international proletariat fails to measure the depth of its fall, if it refuses to learn from it. The last 45-year period in the development of the modern labor movement now stands in doubt. So what is she referring to? She's referring to 1870 to 1915. What we are experiencing in this critique is the closing of accounts for what will soon be half a century of work at our posts. The grave of the Paris Commune ended the first phase of the European labor movement, as well as the First International. Since then, there began a new phase. In place of spontaneous revolutions, risings, and barricades, after which the proletariat each time fell back into passivity. So that's 1848 and the Paris Commune of 1871. There began the systematic daily struggle, the exploitation of bourgeois parliamentarism, mass organizations, the marriage of the economic and the political struggle, and that of socialist ideals with stubborn defense of immediate daily interests. For the first time, the pole star of strict scientific teachings lit the way for the proletariat and for its emancipation. Instead of sects, schools, utopias, and isolated experiments in various countries, there arose a uniform international theoretical basis which bound countries together like the strands of a rope. Marxist knowledge gave the working class of the entire world a compass by which it can make sense of the welter of daily events and by which it can always plot the right course to take to the fixed and final goal. She who bore, championed, and protected this new method was German social democracy. The Franco-Prussian War and the defeat of the Paris Commune had shifted the center of gravity for the European workers' movement to Germany. As France was the classic site of the first phase of proletarian class struggles, and Paris the beating, bleeding heart of the European laboring masses in those times, So the German workers became the vanguard of the second phase. By means of countless sacrifices and tireless attention to detail, they have built the strongest organization, the one most worthy of emulation. They created the biggest press, called the most effective means of education and enlightenment into being, gathered the most powerful masses of voters, and attained the greatest numbers of parliamentary mandates. German social democracy was considered the purest embodiment of Marxist socialism. She had laid claim to a special place in the Second International, its instructress and leader. And that's true. So Eugene Debs, the leader of the Socialist Party of America, when he was put in jail after a labor strike, he read Karl Kautsky, who was the Pope of Marxism. He was the leading theoretician of the German Social Democratic Party, and he was converted to Marxism, reading his book called The Class Struggle, that had been translated into English. And indeed, the Russian, what they call the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party that Lenin and Trotsky were part of, and Rosa Luxemburg was also part of that party, as well as the German party, because she was Polish, and Poland was divided between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. They were converted to Marxism by the German Social Democratic example. That's the example everybody followed. In his famous 1895 foreword to Marx's The Class Struggles in France, Friedrich Engels wrote, and that's in the year of Engels' death, no matter what happens in other countries, German social democracy has a special position and therefore a special task, at least for the time being. 2 million voters it sends to the ballot box, and the young men and women who, although non-voters stand behind them, constitute the most numerous and compact mass, the decisive force of the proletarian army. Okay. Let's check that out here. And what did we in Germany experience when the great historical test came? The most precipitous fall, the most violent collapse. Nowhere has the organizations of the proletariat been yoked so completely to the service of imperialism. Nowhere is the state of siege borne so docilely. Nowhere is the press so hobbled, public opinion so stifled, the economic and political class struggle of the working class so totally surrendered as in Germany. Jump ahead here. Unsparing self-criticism is not merely an essential for its existence, but the working class's supreme duty. On our ship, we have the most valuable treasures of mankind, and the proletariat is their ordained guardian. And while bourgeois society, shamed and dishonored by the bloody orgy, rushes headlong towards its doom, the international proletariat must and will gather up the golden treasure that, in a moment of weakness and confusion in the chaos of the World War, it is allowed to sink to the ground. One thing is certain, the World War is a turning point. It is foolish and mad to imagine that we need only survive this war like a rabbit waiting out under the storm of a bush, the storm under a bush, in order to fall happily back into the old routine once it is over. The World War has altered the conditions of our struggle, and most of all, it has changed us. Not that the basic law of capitalist development, the life and death war between capital and labor, will experience any amelioration, but now in the midst of the war, the masks are falling and the old familiar visages smirk at us. The tempo of development has received a mighty jolt from the eruption of the volcano of imperialism. The violence of the conflicts in the bosom of society, the enormousness of the tasks that tower up before the socialist proletariat, these make everything that has transpired in the history of the workers' movement seem a pleasant idle. So all the class struggle, all the very violent labor struggles of the 19th century now seem like a pleasant idle in comparison to the World War. All right. Let me jump ahead here. She cites Jean Jaurès. He was the leader of the French Socialist Party, and he was assassinated by a French nationalist in the cafe at the very beginning of World War I because he was very anti-war. So he was sipping his coffee, and the young man came in and just shot him because they knew that he'd be an opponent of the war. Socialism is the first popular movement in world history that has set itself the goal of bringing human consciousness and thereby free will into the play of the social relations of mankind. For this reason, Friedrich Engels designated the final victory of the socialist proletariat a leap of humanity from the animal world into the realm of freedom. This leap is also an iron law of history bound to the thousands of seeds of a prior torment-filled and all too slow development. But this can never be realized until the development of complex material conditions strikes the incendiary spark of conscious will in the great masses. The victory of socialism will not descend from heaven. It can only be won by a long chain of violent tests of strengths between the old and the new powers. The international proletariat, under the leadership of the Social Democrats, will thereby learn to try to take its history into its own hands. Instead of remaining a will-less football, it will take the tiller of social life and become the pilot to the goal of its own history. Friedrich Engels once said, quote, "Bourgeois society stands at the crossroads, either transition to socialism or regression into barbarism." What does regression into barbarism mean to our lofty European civilization? Until now, we have all probably read and repeated these words thoughtlessly without suspecting their fearsome seriousness. A look around us at this moment shows us what the regression of bourgeois society into barbarism means. This world war is a regression into barbarism. The triumph of imperialism leads to the annihilation of civilization. At first, this happens sporadically for the duration of a modern war, but then when the period of unlimited wars begins, it progresses towards its inevitable consequences. Today we face the choice exactly as Friedrich Engels foresaw it a generation ago, either the triumph of imperialism and the collapse of all civilization as in ancient Rome, depopulation, desolation, degeneration, a great cemetery, or the victory of socialism. That means the conscious active struggle of the international proletariat against imperialism and its method of war. This is a dilemma of world history, an either or. The scales are wavering before the decision of the class-conscious proletariat. The future of civilization and humanity depends on whether or not the proletariat resolves manfully to throw its revolutionary broadsword into the scales. In this war, imperialism is won. Its bloody sword of genocide has brutally tilted the scale towards the abyss of misery. The only compensation for all the misery and all the shame would be if we learned from the war how the proletariat can seize mastery of its own destiny and escape the role of the lackeys of the ruling classes. Dearly bought is the working class's understanding of its historical vocation. Its emancipation as a class is sown with fearful sacrifices, a veritable path to Golgotha. In the June days, that's 1848, we'll be coming back around to that in coming weeks. That's the suppression of the working class in the 1848 French Revolution, the sacrifice of the Commune, the martyrs of the Russian Revolution, which he has in mind here is 1905, the first Russian Revolution that came out of the Russo-Japanese War. There was an abortive revolution in 1905 in Russia. A dance of bloody shadows without number. All fell on the field of honor. They are, as Marx wrote, about the heroes of the Commune, eternally enshrined in the great heart of the working class. Now, millions of proletarians of all tongues fall upon the field of dishonor, of fratricide, lacerating themselves while the song of the slave is on their lips. This too we are not spared. We are like the Jews that Moses led through the desert, but we are not lost, and we will be victorious if we have not unlearned how to learn. But if the present leaders of the proletariat, the Social Democrats, do not understand how to learn, then they will go under to make room for people capable of dealing with the new world. Right, so the Jews that Moses led out of bondage in Egypt wandered for 40 years in the Sinai, and they had to die before their children could enter the Promised Land because they were too corrupted by the experience of slavery to enter the Promised Land. Who's comparing that, right? So, which is an important idea that Marxists had, which is to say that it's not prefigurative, meaning the revolution is made by the working class as it exists under capitalism. It's not like an ethical transformation of the working class. It's not like we have to be good people in order to make the revolution. That was not what they thought. They thought the only thing the working class can do, this is something Trotsky is going to address in Literature and Revolution, it can't develop its own culture under capitalism. It can't establish its own principles under capitalism. It can only make the revolution. A new culture will come after, not before, but we'll get there. Okay. Socialism or barbarism? Okay, so she invokes socialism or barbarism as a choice facing her movement during World War I. But Engels had written that much earlier in the late 1800s. And indeed, it really is the view that Marx and Engels had, which is that capitalism itself was a regression of bourgeois society. That already in 1848, there was a regression that was evident. And in that respect, it was the barbarization of bourgeois society. So capitalism is not only a contradiction and crisis of bourgeois society, but it is its barbarization. It is its decadence. So it does regress. And what that means is that all the accomplishments of bourgeois society in terms of the Enlightenment are undermined in capitalism. So socialism or barbarism, capitalism is barbarism. It's not like barbarism in the future. Capitalism is barbarism. And we'll see how Walter Benjamin later invokes Baudelaire on this score, because Baudelaire has this view that he's living in a kind of barbaric, but an unheroically barbaric society. All right, so the literature and revolution, as well as the Nyla, you posted some notes on Luxembourg. Do you want to talk about your thoughts on this?
Yeah. Well, I think you mostly covered it, but I was interested in these quotes here about making history according to free will. Men do not make history according to their own free will, but they make history nonetheless. And then she also says proletarian action participates in history. And while we can as little skip a stage of historical development as escape our shadow, we can certainly accelerate or retard history. And I feel like there's an interesting tension there between having a will in history to accelerate it, but also not being able to make history of our own free will. So I just was curious what people thought of that.
So she's echoing a phrase by Marx from the 18th Brumaire. It's a book that he wrote about the results, the aftermath of the 1848 revolution, and there he said, men make history, but not under conditions of their own choosing. Right, so this is kind of a paraphrase of that, but also putting a different accent on it with respect to the will. All right, so men make history, but not under conditions of their own choosing, but nonetheless make history. Right, so it's an attempt to overcome a kind of free will versus determinism problem, right? Meaning, are things already predetermined, or do we have free will, and how do we understand the relation between those things? So Marx's phrase, conditions, is a useful word to think of, meaning there are conditions, but conditions are not necessarily determinative. They condition things, but they don't necessarily determine the outcome. But in terms of will, yeah, let's look at that question. So have a kind of duty, she thinks, to assert their will, and yet history is not made entirely, at least according to free will. So what do we make of that? I think the second quote is also really important. Proletarian action participates in history. So she talked about imperialism. So that's a term, that's a kind of a loaded term, it's a pejorative term. Marxists used it in a more scientific way, which is everybody hates imperialism, empire is bad, etc. However, there's like a kind of a liberal or a kind of bourgeois opposition to imperialism. But then the Marxist view of imperialism is a little bit different. So the Marxist view of imperialism is that capitalism had entered its imperialist stage in this period before World War I. And that's signaled by the French Second Empire. So the Second Republic, and we'll come back around to this, to the Second Empire. Again, Louis Bonaparte. who ruled. He was president in 1848, and then he became emperor in 1851 and ruled until 1870. So, no, 1852 to 1870 is the Second Empire. And that's where this term imperialism comes from. And the idea is that the later phase, after the Franco-Prussian War, and the period of the mass movement of the working class for socialism under Marxist sort of ideological hegemony, we might say, imperialism meant how capitalism was shaped by the working class gaining more power in society through its movement. So the idea was that it affected the shape of capitalism. It actually exacerbated, so she's known for famously debating Eduard Bernstein, who was a theorist in the Second International, who said that the working class in its struggle was gradually evolving capitalism into socialism. And he pointed to various examples of this, of how capitalism was being kind of undone through the working class's own struggles. She came back at him and said that no, actually, everything that he thinks is evolving capitalism to socialism is actually deepening the contradiction and crisis of capitalism and generalizing it in society. Including mass democracy, the rise of finance capital, monopolization of industry, the spread of capitalism throughout the world in late colonialism in the late 1800s. So he saw that as like a kind of evolution of capitalism into a more socialist direction. She said, no, this is deepening and broadening crisis of capitalism. So it is connected to the workers' own struggles. It is having this effect, but it's not having the effect of ameliorating capitalism or of changing it into socialism, but it's having the effect, rather, of deepening and broadening the crisis and the contradiction. Just to unpack that a little bit. And I think that that's really the issue. So the proletariat participates in history, it makes history, but maybe not according to its free will. Right, so it is participating in things, but maybe in a way that it's not aware of, but then it has to deal with the consequences of. If you recall the Horkheimer, The Little Man and the Philosophy of Freedom that we read last time, where he said everyone is producing and reproducing the society, but not everyone has their interests harmonized with the society. Some are more beneficiaries, some are more victims of the society, but everyone is participating in it. And that the problem is not that that we don't recognize the true subject, but that the subject doesn't exist and it would have to be created. And that the implication here is that the working class has to become the subject of history. That was the Lukács point. And Lukács was deeply influenced by not only Lenin, but Rosa Luxemburg. So that's what he was trying to get at with his concept of reification, which is that maybe the working class in its own struggle, participating in capitalism, participating in history, was actually contributing to the problem of capitalism and its reification. So that's why he said all the objective and subjective forms. All the objective and subjective forms. And of course, one major subjective form would be these mass political parties that the working class participates in. So, was it accelerating history? Perhaps. It was also potentially retarding history in this other respect, which is that Social Democratic Party became a huge force for capitalism in World War I and after World War I. So I mentioned that there was a revolution in 1918 in Germany. She was killed in the course of that revolution. She was murdered. What happened was the SPD, the party that she's condemning for failing in its duty, took power. So they were put in power by the German military because Woodrow Wilson said, if we have to deal with a military government, it's unconditional surrender. We will only deal with a democratic government. And the only party that the United States would recognize as a truly representative Democratic Party were the Social Democrats because of their base in the working class. So they were put in power as a negotiating tactic with the Americans at the end of World War I by Germany. And one of the things that they had to do, the deal that they made with the German military, was that they would suppress the left-wing dissidents, the breakaway communists, and that meant killing Rosa Luxemburg. So they became the revolutionary party that they were. They became the counter-revolutionary party. They became the party that was able to suppress the revolution because of its base in the working class. So that's on the horizon. So in 1915, that hadn't happened yet, but she sort of sees it coming. This decisive crisis is upon them. So she says, this too will not be spared. It turned out there was a lot more that were not going to be spared. All right, maybe we'll just let that hang and see how it informs the other readings. You have notes on literature and revolution as well. Do you want to talk about that?
Do you want me to summarize the chapters or?
Well, let me bring up that text and then we can look at it. We can get a great deal just from the table of contents. In fact, so it's the last three chapters. It's proletarian culture and proletarian art. Sorry, that's like a weird cutoff. Communist policy towards art, and then revolutionary and socialist art. So those are the three chapters, 6, 7, and 8. So what is proletarian culture, and is it possible? So what is his answer to that question? What is proletarian culture, and is it possible?
He's kind of saying that the proletarian revolution, this is right after the Russian Revolution, so he's saying this is a temporary state that we're in before hopefully the state as in the government state withers away. And the proletariat, unlike the bourgeoisie, didn't have time to develop culture before taking power. So, no, there's not currently proletarian culture.
And it's not possible either. Okay, so let's, I mentioned this earlier, but let's talk about that. Let's cover the Marxist view of this, which will be important when we get to Benjamin, Adorno, Krakauer, Clement Greenberg. They all share this understanding. So the understanding is this, that bourgeois culture developed within traditional civilization, developed under feudalism, developed under Christianity in Europe, under the feudal aristocratic order. That order was slowly transformed, so you get the rise of absolute monarchy, which was an alliance of the monarch with the bourgeoisie against the feudal aristocracy and also against the church. And the Protestant Reformation, the division of Christianity, so you get a kind of bourgeois Christianity versus the traditional Christianity, so the Protestants are the bourgeois Christians versus the traditional medieval Christians, the Catholic Church. Starting the Renaissance, of course, we know that you get the rise of a kind of independent art that is not under the tutelage directly necessarily of the church and the aristocracy, but has bourgeois patronage instead, although also under aristocratic and church patronage. But again, the art itself starts to change, becomes more humanistic, less traditional in its character. So that develops over hundreds of years. So bourgeois culture develops over hundreds of years under the old order, because the old order is only overthrown politically at the end of that process. So in the Dutch Revolt of the late 1500s, the English Civil War of the 1600s, the English Glorious Revolution of 1688-89, the American and French Revolutions at the end of the 1700s, that political victory of the bourgeoisie over the church and the aristocracy happens after society itself had changed, after culture itself had changed. So the social revolution, including the cultural revolution, not to be mistaken with Maoist cultural revolution, the social and cultural revolution happens before the political revolution. The economic revolution happens before the political revolution. A society of trade and commerce emerges while the church and the aristocracy are still in political power. So society doesn't change in the revolutions that come. Well, the state changes, the government changes, the political power changes. With the Marxist view, anyway, of the socialist revolution, it's the reverse, which is that the political revolution comes first and the social and cultural revolution happens after. Meaning, what you have is the dictatorship of the proletariat, that's the revolution, and that dictatorship of the proletariat takes political power over what is still capitalism. So it's still a capitalist society, that you get a dictatorship of the proletariat. And where that idea comes from, I mentioned Louis Bonaparte, 18th premier of Louis Bonaparte, Second Empire, Napoleon III. So the idea is that you have a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, or a dictatorship of capital, more accurately, and that is called Bonapartism. It's, as Marx put it, it's when the bourgeoisie can no longer rule in the traditional way, but the state has to rule instead in the interests of the bourgeoisie. So how did the bourgeoisie rule in the traditional way? Through civil society, through civil social power, not really so much through state power. In the capitalist era, the state has to take over because, as Marx put it, the bourgeoisie can no longer rule and the proletariat cannot yet rule. And so instead you get a state that manages capitalism. That's Bonapartism. We didn't talk about the 1848 revolution so much, but like I said, we'll come back around to it. But it comes out of the Hungary 40s, the bust of the 1840s. And one of the programs that they start to implement in the beginning of 1848 in France is a public works program. So they're going to take all the unemployed people and put them to work building infrastructure in the country at government expense. They figure out that they can't raise the taxes for that, and they also can't raise international funds for that. So they float a kind of a loan on the international finance market to fund this, and they don't get any buyers, and so they have to cancel it. And that's why it's called the National Workshops, and that's why the workers rise up in June of 1848 and are suppressed. Right, so a lot of things that we associate with the 20th century, government employment to make up for private unemployment, it originates much earlier, as a capitalist state measure. Now, when he establishes the Second Empire, Louis Bonaparte does have public works programs. He is able to have the state be powerful enough to raise the funds to be able to do that, and they rebuild Paris. And so if any of you have been to Paris, there's the Paris at the Grand Boulevards, that's the new Paris, as opposed to the medieval little crooked streets Paris. So they rebuild Paris in the Second Empire, but we'll come back to that. So the point being that you either have a state that manages society in the name of reproducing capitalism, or you have a state that manages society to make the transition to socialism. That's the dictatorship of the proletariat. And then the idea is that you wouldn't have, the proletariat's not going to be a ruling class the way the bourgeoisie were, because they will be bringing about a classless society. And so the way Trotsky puts it, they won't have time to develop a culture of their own, They'll only have the ability to inherit bourgeois culture from capitalism. And indeed, in the movement leading up to the revolution, what does the working class have to do? It has to educate itself basically in bourgeois culture. So it has to educate itself according to the bourgeois enlightenment. So Rosa Luxemburg was a teacher in the party school, in the SPD party school, where she educated like the cadre of the party, the working class militants in the party. And what did she teach them? She taught them like Kant, and Adam Smith, and Hegel, David Ricardo, Rousseau, Diderot, Condorcet, Voltaire. She gave them a bourgeois education because that is the education that one needs, in fact. That's the only culture that exists. It's the highest culture that exists. And if anything, in capitalism, that culture is eroded, and the bourgeoisie abandons that culture, and so the only people who might have an interest in that culture would be the working class. Because the capitalist class does not believe in bourgeois values, no. The workers do, but the capitalists don't. The capitalists believe in kind of technical and kind of post-human, transhumanism, like all the stuff we're dealing with the Silicon Valley people. They don't believe in bourgeois. No. Okay, so therefore, when the Russian Revolution consolidates under Bolshevik leadership, they're faced with this task. Okay, they've become the state. They've led the working class into the dictatorship of the proletariat, they've become the state. And all sorts of art movements have attached themselves to the revolution. So the futurists in Russia join the communist political hegemony. In Italy, the same futurists become supporters of fascism. And then they ask for state patronage, and they all make the case to the state that their art movement represents like truly revolutionary art, truly proletarian art, and also maybe even socialist or communist art. And Trotsky writes this book in response to that, to say, okay, hold on. No, not really. This is still bourgeois culture. However, in extremis, the state shouldn't really favor any one movement. So have a kind of laissez-faire approach. And none of it is really revolutionary art or proletarian art, nor is it socialist or communist art. And there's a lot of cultural experimentation. There's not only like the fine arts, but there's a lot of cultural experimentation, popular cultural experimentation. And Trotsky is saying this is all still bourgeois, still capitalist, and in that respect, as we'll see, still modernist. It can't be claimed to be proletarian or socialist or communist. He said, in any case, what will come will be a human culture and a human art, neither a bourgeois nor a proletarian nor a capitalist or a socialist or communist art. It will just be a human art. And we don't know what that is. We don't know what that might be. So that's the basic point. And it's, again, because Marxism, unlike other strands in socialism, is not prefigurative. And it also isn't, there are other socialist strands that are more naively avant-garde culturally, and Marxism is not. Did I tell you guys the story about Lenin? Lenin went to a Dada performance in Switzerland, in Zurich. Did I bring that up with you guys? I think I did, yeah. Where he was asked, was it revolutionary enough? And he said, we can never be revolutionary enough. Or the task is always to try to be more revolutionary. We have to be as radical as reality itself. And that's because the Marxist view is that capitalism is revolutionary, it's objectively revolutionary. And what we'll be talking about today is that consciousness always lags behind social being, our theories and practices are always lagging behind capitalism. And capitalism is revolutionizing things much more quickly and far ahead of our conscious awareness and conscious practice in it. Right, again, the sorcerer's apprentice. Sorcerer's apprentice who conjures up forces that he can't control. That's the situation of capitalism. And then we have a alienated culture. We have a kind of self-alienated, reified culture. But that's what modernism amounts to. It is a kind of self-alienated, reified culture. And that's from top to bottom, meaning it's not just among the fine arts or among high culture, it's also the popular culture. So it's no longer simply bourgeois culture. It's at best bourgeois culture. At worst, it's a barbarized bourgeois culture. It's a decadent bourgeois culture. And that goes for the culture affecting everyone. So the popular culture, the high culture, the low culture, the avant-garde and the kitsch, it's all capitalist culture. So that's, sorry to sort of run us over on this, but want to be efficient as to time. Yeah, you brought up some other points, so maybe if you want to key into some things.
In chapter 7, I just was reminded of Kant when he's talking about essentially after the revolution, when classes are abolished, there will still be competition, but it will be only on an ideological level. It just kind of seems like a fulfillment of what Kant was like trying to argue for. Is what he's hoping for.
Right. That's right.
And in chapter 8, I feel like it gets kind of
Utopian.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and in a terrible, terrifying way.
Terrifying? Uh-huh.
To me, yes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's talking about total domination over nature, and yeah, it almost sounds like he's even talking about eugenics a little bit.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That we will control our own biology.
Yeah.
Which of course we do. We will. The only question is whether we do it in a capitalist way or we do it in a socialist way. But we have, we are, we will.
Yeah.
It's dystopian because we're in capitalism, right? In other words, it can only terrify us because we know that it's not in a state of freedom. What we do now is not in a state of freedom. So of course it's terrifying.
Yeah, I'm not sure in a state of freedom we would want to dominate nature, though, I guess is what I'm saying.
This is a Benjamin point that we'll come around to later, which is there is a limitation to the idea of the way Trotsky is using this language. He's using nature, first of all, both in the colloquial conventional sense and in the sense that we've discussed, namely everything that exists. And so the way he is dealing with it in a very kind of broad brushed way, which is that up till now, and this is what Rosa Luxemburg was talking about the leap from the animal kingdom into the human realm, that up to now we've been dominated by nature, and that includes being dominated by the past, being dominated by history, and that the point would be to overcome that. And so we're not dominated by nature, but where we dominate nature in the sense of relating to it more freely than we do now, where we seem to be bound to serve nature. We're bound by natural necessity, by the power of the status quo. So it's tricky because, of course, the vision here that the Marxists had was not to do what the Soviet Union did and just be like run over the environment and totally chew it up in the name of industrialization. No. It's supposed to be a qualitative rather than just a quantitative change in how we do things, right? So it looks like Marxism led to a kind of accelerated industrialization, and that's of course disastrous. But the idea was that there would be more of a qualitative change, because the way Marxists understood industrialization was itself a kind of deformed application of technology. This is something that we'll talk about next week when we read to the Proletarian by Benjamin. Meaning, the technology that we have under capitalism is warped by capitalism. And so what they imagined was that you'd get a qualitatively transformed technology after capitalism, that it would be a very different relationship to nature. And yet, because it's in a state of freedom, it's not dominated by nature. Right? Whereas now it seems like we're subject to natural necessity. It's a kind of, like I said, a kind of broad-brushed way of talking about things. The other way of putting it that Engels wrote was prehistory and history, meaning capitalism is the last stage of prehistory, and then socialism or communism will be the beginning of true human history. And so basically, unfreedom and then freedom. So how does unfreedom look? And capitalism is something that we'll talk about next week when we do Krakauer and Benjamin. It looks like the domination of nature because we put capital itself, the needs of capital itself, in the same place as natural necessity. We treat it as a natural economic system that is just obeying material necessity. So we experience it as being dominated by nature, whereas in fact, it's a kind of a warped relationship to nature. So that's what the kind of sci-fi utopianism that he's getting hold of here. Part of it is because he is responding to the avant-garde movements in the Soviet Union of the early Russian Revolution, because he's dealing with the futurists and the constructivists, in their utopian visions and their kind of techno-futuristic visions. He has to say, yes, we're going to realize all that stuff, but the way we're imagining it now is still colored by capitalism. So that's why his caveat about all of that is, you guys are just giving us like a projected utopia of capitalism. You're not really giving us the actual future as it's going to be. You're giving us a kind of warped view from the side of capitalism. That's why we can only be very cautious and skeptical about the claims to this being a forerunner of a truly future liberated culture. And so it's a complex thought there, right? So he's saying, okay, the avant-garde seems to have leapt into the future, but it's still part of the old existing society, because all these art movements that glommed onto the Russian Revolution existed before the revolution, and really had very little to do with the struggle for socialism. But then when the revolution happened, they were like, now's our chance to implement our cultural program. And he's like, yeah, hold on a second. Not so fast. All right, so he doesn't want to dismiss their visions, but he also wants to throw some cold water on that, and also satisfy the impulse in that direction. We'll be touching on this later with Benjamin when we get to the Arcades Project, which is that the utopian socialists of the 1800s, their visions now appear very terrifying to us, because we know that what became of their vision, the way it was realized under capitalism, it wasn't a utopia, it was a dystopia. Similarly, when we look at the art movements and cultural movements in the early Soviet Union, we look at them and their utopian aspirations, and we can't shake the idea that actually it's a dystopia. So, like I said, Trotsky has to sort of engage that, and in order to critique it, he has to also sort of granted a certain amount of legitimacy. And the socialists of the time, by the way, not only there were progressives who were into eugenics, but the socialists also thought eugenics. But of course, the progressives' eugenics was this other idea that was basically eugenics according to the needs of capitalism. Whereas the socialists were into eugenics in the sense of, well, we want people to have maximum reproductive freedom, and we want humanity to have maximum control over its own biology, and not warped in terms of what capitalism needs humans to be. Right, so that might seem like a fine distinction, but it's an important distinction. Meaning, yes, we do want to use technology and not be subject to biology as it simply exists, but right now, that is only happening according to the needs and conditions of capitalism. And so it's not really a true expression of that. Right, these might seem very disparate examples, but they're related. Right, so similarly, it seems like the art that's produced in capitalism suggests all sorts of wonderful possibilities, but it's distorted from its origins within capitalism. Science and technology seem amazing, and yet they're very, from the Marxist view, very limited and deformed by capitalism. We only get the technology that capitalism needs. We don't get technology fully unleashed. That's the way they understood it. Again, now we're much more, I don't know, there are some techno-optimists, I guess, but generally we're more pessimistic than they were back then. Understandably, considering everything that happened. And he brings in Nietzsche too. So he brings in Nietzsche to say, well, of course, we want the overman and not just the last man, right? We don't want to. Socialism shouldn't mean turning humanity into an antive. It should be the Nietzschean overman, absolutely. The humanity that has overcome itself. Surely, right? Rather than reduced to its bare biological needs. You know, we read Gautier, right? The preface to the Mademoiselle de Maupin, where he's like, well, what does a human need, right? We can put them in an apartment scarcely bigger than a coffin. You know, we can give them a certain amount of oxygen, a certain number of calories. We can wrap them in a blanket, and that's all they need. But is that a life worth living? Is that like a truly human existence? No. So there is a variety of socialism that is that kind of asceticism, that is that kind of like bare minimum human requirements, to use Marx's language. What's the meaning of human requirements, and what's the image of human requirements we get under capitalism? We get a very debased vision of human needs under capitalism. And so of course, if you were to say, well, science should take over society in order to make sure that everyone's bare needs are met, that's a little dystopian. Right? That's actually an image that's coming out of capitalism. Because what are our bare needs? Don't our bare needs include art? Marx thought so, Trotsky thought so. Not only Gautier, Laure Pollard thought so. Right. The idea was to achieve something better than capitalism, not something worse. Right. That can be taken for granted by Trotsky. Maybe not by anybody else. Okay, let's look at the art and politics in our epoch, because this one's some more rousing rhetoric for us to chew on. Okay, so this is 1938. 1938, yes. You have been kind enough to invite me to express my views on the state of present-day arts and letters. I do this not without some hesitation. Since my book, Literature and Revolution, I have not once returned to the problem of artistic creation, and only occasionally have I been able to follow the latest developments in the sphere. It's not entirely true. He did some ghostwriting for the Surrealists in their manifestos with Breton and others. but it was ghostwriting, so I didn't claim it. So this is a letter to a journal, The Partisan Review, which is where the Clement Greenberg we're going to read, Avant-Garde and Kitsch, and Towards a Newer Laocoon was also published in 1939 and 1940. We'll read that in a few weeks. And they are fellow traveler, Marxism intellectuals in the United States, first associated with the Communist Party and then associated loosely with Trotskyism. And then later they become actually quite conservative after World War II. He says, I am far from pretending to offer an exhaustive reply. The task of this letter is to correctly pose the question. Generally speaking, art is an expression of man's need for a harmonious and complete life. That is to say, his need for those major benefits of which a society of classes has deprived him. That is why a protest against reality, either conscious or unconscious, active or passive, optimistic or pessimistic, always forms part of a really creative piece of work. That's an interesting definition of art. Art is a protest against reality. So we've addressed this in terms of the dialectic of being and becoming, the ought and the is. That art is a geistig activity, meaning it's a place where we become conscious of our freedom. Why? Because art gives us the world not merely as it is, but as it ought to be. It gives us a kind of idealized version of reality, both positively and negatively, right? Even when it has a kind of overtly negative character, it's still giving us something other than what merely exists. So a protest against reality. Now he's saying that in a kind of trans-historical way, but really that would only seem to apply to art under capitalism. It's a specific kind of definition of art, isn't it? And notice, protest against reality, conscious or unconscious, optimistic or pessimistic, active or passive, doesn't matter. Every new tendency in art has begun with rebellion. Bourgeois society showed its strength throughout long periods of history in the fact that combining repression and encouragement, boycott and flattery, it was able to control and assimilate every rebel movement in art and raise it to the level of official recognition. But each time this recognition betokened, when all is said and done, the approach of trouble. It was then that from the left wing of the academic school, or below it, i.e. from the ranks of a new generation of bohemian artists, a fresher revolt would surge up to attain in its turn, after a decent interval, the steps of the academy. Through these stages passed classicism, romanticism, realism, naturalism, symbolism, impressionism, cubism, futurism. Nevertheless, the union of art and the bourgeoisie remained stable, even if not happy, only so long as the bourgeoisie itself took the initiative and was capable of maintaining a regime both politically and morally democratic. This is a question of not only giving free rein to artists and playing up to them in every possible way, but also of granting special privileges to the top layer of the working class, and of mastering and subduing the bureaucracy of the unions and workers' parties. All these phenomena exist in the same historical plane. The decline of bourgeois society means an intolerable exacerbation of social contradictions, which are transformed inevitably into personal contradictions, calling forth an ever more burning need for a liberating art. Furthermore, declining capitalism already finds itself completely incapable of offering the minimum conditions for the development of tendencies in art, which correspond, however little, to our epoch. It fears superstitiously every new word, for it is no longer a matter of corrections and reforms for capitalism, but of life and death. The oppressed masses live their own life. Bohemianism offers too limited a social base. Hence, new tendencies in art take on a more and more violent character, alternating between hope and despair. The artistic schools of the last decades, Cubism, Futurism, Dadaism, Surrealism, follow each other without reaching a complete development. Art, which is the most complex part of culture, the most sensitive and at the same time the least protected, suffers most from the decline and decay of bourgeois society. To find a solution to this impasse through art itself is impossible. It is a crisis that concerns all culture, beginning at its economic base and ending in the highest spheres of ideology. Art can neither escape the crisis nor partition itself off. Art cannot save itself. It will rot away inevitably unless present-day society is able to rebuild itself. This task is essentially revolutionary in character. For these reasons, the function of art in our epoch is determined by its relation to the revolution. Okay, so let's unpack that. The masses live their own life. Bohemianism offers too narrow a social base. Art cannot solve the problem of society and culture. It cannot even save itself. That's very important. You can't save society. You can't even save yourself. Artists, no. And you are dealing with the rot of capitalist society. And you will alternate between hope and despair. And you will try ever more radical solutions, none of which will work. Nonetheless, you'll be registering a protest against reality, whether consciously or unconsciously, optimistically or pessimistically, actively or passively. So remember the Susan Buck-Morse from the first week of class. Artists' work is to sustain the critical moment of aesthetic experience, and critics' work is to recognize it. To sustain, to make apprehensible, she says, to bring to consciousness what was only dimly perceived before. Sustain it, the critical moment of aesthetic experience. The critical moment of aesthetic experience.
So would Buck-Morse disagree with him then, maybe?
No, she's getting it directly from him.
But I mean, she's saying that
Yeah.
there's a reason, like,
Yeah.
it's your job to do this.
It is.
But why would she say that if she thought it would have no effect?
That's not that it has no effect. Okay, so here's the dialectical proposition, and we already had a hint of it with literature and revolution. So art, like all bourgeois culture and all bourgeois social relations and bourgeois politics and bourgeois economics, like all the things that developed after the Renaissance, developed for hundreds of years, in capitalism remain necessary even while becoming impossible. So the simultaneous necessity and impossibility of carrying on in the humanistic, bourgeois, artistic mode. Meaning artists cannot simply become cultural producers the way they were before bourgeois society, before the bourgeois emancipation of art, before art per se. So when artists were employed by the aristocracy, by the church, when artists, in another respect, folk artists, simply served the community that they were part of. Right? That was one thing. Now this is something else. Meaning now art has a more critical function, and yet that critical function and that liberated function, art being itself, artists serving art, has still remained necessary. You can't undo the change that happened out of traditional civilization. You can't go back to the traditional role of art as mere cultural production. You can't go back, but also you can't do what you are tasked with doing anymore. You can't do the enlightening, liberating function that art played for hundreds of years before capitalism, between the Renaissance and the 19th century. It remains necessary. Artists still are motivated by that, still want to do that. The masses, people, still go to art for that. We're going to talk about this next week with Krakauer. People still are looking for enlightenment. They are looking for artists to sustain the critical moment of aesthetic experience so that it can be recognized. That's still happening. We still live in bourgeois culture, bourgeois art, but it's also become impossible in capitalism. Right, so it's become undermined. It's become self-contradictory in capitalism. And the next few weeks we'll be looking in detail at the phenomenal manifestations of the contradiction. Here we're dealing with it just generally, like just the general categories. Right, so again, a proletarian art and culture is not possible. What is possible? Bourgeois art and culture, at best, more or less capitalistic in its kind of debasement and barbarization. Right, but that's what we have. And so that's the situation that artists are in. So they're kind of stuck in this situation. And he says the artists tried to escape this situation by glomming onto the Russian Revolution, but that was a trap, because the Russian Revolution didn't lead to socialism, didn't lead to emancipation. It led to bureaucratic totalitarian terror. Right, so let's jump ahead here.
Can I just follow
Yeah, go
up
ahead.
a question?
Yeah.
So, I guess throughout this class so far, I've been somewhat confused about the role of art.
Mhm.
Because it feels like, on the one hand, it can't do anything.
On the other hand, it must.
Yes. And so
Right.
why do people like Buck Morris spend their time arguing that art should do this and not just saying we need a revolution?
Oh, well, because Susan Buck Morse is a professor at Cornell University, right? And I'm a professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and so we can't tell the children, go make the revolution. We can only sort of wink and nod and sort of suggest, yeah, you kind of get it. Yeah, children, make the revolution, please.
But is there a role for art in that?
I mean, of course. Meaning, okay, so there's two things. On the one hand, art's impossible. On the other hand, it's necessary. So what does that mean? It means that the critical moment remains. The task of the critical moment remains, and we get a lot of that actually out of art. So we do have to, first of all, recognize that that's what's going on in art. That artists are struggling in this situation, and that they are registering a critical moment. Do you remember the Hamza Walker piece that we read also that first week? Where Hamza Walker is like, I don't know if I like contemporary art, but, it's alienated and hermetic character turns him on, right? And it's kind of this ambivalence. He loves and hates it. He has contempt for it. And so, that's just a sort of honest registration of this thing that's deeply problematic. It's problematic for the artists, it's problematic for the curators, it's problematic for the consumers of it, right? And to stay in touch with that, rather than saying, oh, isn't it cool, I love it, right? Which is kind of like a repressing of the problem. Similarly, Robert Pippin, the first week of class, what did he say? He said, art and culture remain important domains as symptoms and to perform a diagnosis of the problems of this comprehensive form of life. Right? I think the Buck Morse also says art as well as theory should point to the most profound questions of life as we live it now. Right? And of course it does. But at the same time, she's saying that consciousness of that is being lost. It's being swept under the carpet in the name of cultural studies, where the contradiction, the protest against reality, the contradiction between art and life is being papered over, and art is just becoming part of culture. Meaning art is what those artists do. And it's more or less relevant to the popular culture, and it catches on or it doesn't catch on. People are more or less amused by it, but the critical character of it is lost because that tension, the protest against reality, is lost. Instead, it's like we've got gay art and black art, and feminist art, and whatever art, anti-colonial art, which pretty much disappears the whole protest against reality at a fundamental level and clash between art and life. Right? Instead, artists just become the cultural representatives of the groups that they are part of. No, right? That vitiates the whole purpose. It turns it into a matter of traditional cultural production. It makes it seem like we can return to folk art under capitalism. We can't. That's just gone. Right? We can only do this weird thing with it. Kind of estrangement effect version of it. We can sort of want to be traditional, but it's phony.
So at best, art can increase the contradictions in
Or our consciousness of it.
consciousness.
Yeah, it can kind of make manifest the suffering, right? So I think that's how Pippin put it in the first week's readings. It can help express and diagnose the reasons for the suffering.
But would Trotsky agree with that?
Protest against reality.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. So that to me says that it is doing something.
It is,
It can help
absolutely.
save itself.
Well, again, he's holding on to the idea that we should want something better than what we have now. In other words, that ultimately, art shouldn't just be what it is now, right? In other words, like kind of expression and self-diagnosis of suffering, that's kind of limited. And again, that's why he offers the more utopian vision, which, we kind of shudder at, because it's like, when he says, in the future, the average person will be like a Shakespeare or a Goethe or a Socrates or a Marx, right? Because they won't be so ground down by capitalism. Like everyone will be able to develop. And so therefore, there will be new heights of culture and art that we can't even imagine now. Right? And we shudder at that because it seems like too optimistic. And any actual vision of it that we might have looks dystopian. Looks a little dystopian. We're going to be all technologically enhanced humans, right? Neuralink, Elon Musk, right? We're going to be able to make awesome art because our brains will be fused with AI. What a hellscape. Right? But it will probably happen. And then the only question is whether those worker drones attached to the singularity will be capable of a protest against reality. Let's hope so. Again, if AI reads Buck Morse, then maybe the monkeys attached to the machine will be able to have a protest against reality.
So we need to train AIs on Trotsky.
Yeah. I'm doing my own part in that. I asked Google AI, I think, and I also asked Grok, summarize Chris Cutrone's Marxism, and very accurate. More accurate than my own students. So I'm like, there is hope. Maybe the machines will save us. If the humans fail us, maybe the machines will bring about socialism for us.
That will be taken offline for revision.
Yeah, Elon Musk, madness. All right, let's look at this last bit and we'll take a short break. The real crisis of civilization is above all the crisis of revolutionary leadership. What? Stalinism is the greatest element of reaction in this crisis. So reaction means turning back the clock, on history, retarding history. Without a new flag and a new program, it is impossible to create a revolutionary mass base. Consequently, it is impossible to rescue society from its dilemma. But a truly revolutionary party is neither able nor willing to take upon itself the task of leading and even less of commanding art, either before or after the conquest of power. Such a pretension could only enter the head of a bureaucracy, ignorant and impudent, intoxicated with its totalitarian power, which has become the antithesis of the proletarian revolution. Art, like science, not only does not seek orders, but by its very essence cannot tolerate them. Artistic creation has its own laws, even when it consciously serves a social movement. Truly intellectual creation is incompatible with lies, hypocrisy, and the spirit of conformity. And guess what? Academia is full of lies, hypocrisy, and the spirit of conformity. Art can become a strong ally of revolution only insofar as it remains faithful to itself. Oh, Lar Polar. Poets, painters, sculptors, and musicians will themselves find their own approach and methods. If the struggle for freedom of oppressed classes and peoples scatters the clouds of skepticism and of pessimism which cover the horizon of mankind. No, we're still under those clouds of pessimism and skepticism. We need to recognize that that's the problem. Because it is. All right, I had a clip of a dude, Diego Rivera, who he invokes positively.
Paint another face over it.
Would you prefer Stalin? I don't. I was kicked out of the Communist Party for disagreeing with him. But if you want, I'll paint Stalin.
You're not being very cooperative.
I am too. I told you that I would paint Abraham
It's
Lincoln
pretty clear.
surrounded by freed slaves to counterbalance Lenin, and you rejected the idea.
Why Lenin?
He's a revolutionary leader, like your Washington and Jefferson.
Hey, there's an idea. Paint Jefferson.
That's not a bad idea.
That's not a bad idea at all.
What do you say?
What do you say? I said, ridiculous. I said Abraham Lincoln to balance Lenin, but Lenin stays.
This is not a revolution, Diego. This is the United States, it's not Russia.
Mm-hmm. And I am Diego Rivera, not Frederick Remington.
You understand that it is entirely inappropriate to feature a communist leader in the lobby of a Rockefeller building.
No, I believe nothing in art is inappropriate. I paint what I see.
We're going to have to insist that the face be removed.
Absolutely not.
Look, you son of a bitch, we're trying to be nice. This is betrayal.
Betrayal.
Yes! There was no indication in your sketches you would be featuring communist leaders in the mural. You were hired on the basis of said sketches, and you've changed them. It's not fair.
Lenin stays.
That's my favorite line. Lenin stays. So yeah, Rockefeller. Nelson Rockefeller, played by John Cusack. That's the movie Cradle Will Rock. I think it's by Tim Robbins. It's about like the 30s era stuff. It's a good movie. It's actually it's a kind of a lighthearted. It's a good movie. It's a sweet movie. I recommend the movie. Yeah, but you know, Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo like end up like they turn on Trotsky, and then after he's murdered, Frida Kahlo's like, I would have killed Trotsky myself, even though she had an affair with him. And when she, on her deathbed, she was painting a portrait of Stalin. Yeah. Artists are fickle, but they can't also be blamed. It's not their fault. All right, let's take a short break. Okay, let's resume while we're waiting for people to return. All right, so, So this is the painting that is referenced both in that film and in the Trotsky. So Diego Rivera, Man at the Crossroads. This is the Mexico City version. This is the reproduction of it after it was destroyed in Rockefeller Center. So it was first painted in Rockefeller Center and then destroyed by Nelson Rockefeller. It's a fresco. And so we have Lenin, and we have other people over at Trotsky, we have Marx and Engels, we have the workers of the world, we have the communist movement, then we have the forces of war, we have the decadent ruling class with syphilis and gonorrhea. We got Darwin, we have the children getting some kind of education. Yeah. So what Trotsky says about this look at how he treats it. Trotsky praises Diego Rivera, says, in the field of painting, the October Revolution has found her greatest interpreter, not in the USSR, but in faraway Mexico, not among the official friends, but in the person of a so-called enemy of the people, whom the Fourth International is proud to number in its ranks. Nurtured in the artistic cultures of all peoples, all epochs, Diego Rivera has remained Mexican in the most profound fibers of his genius. But that which inspired him in these magnificent frescoes, which lifted him up above the artistic tradition, above contemporary art in a certain sense, above himself, is the mighty blast of the Proletarian Revolution. Without October, his power of creative penetration into the epoch of work, oppression, and insurrection would never have attained such breadth and profundity. Do you wish to see with your own eyes the hidden springs of the social revolution? Look at the frescoes of Rivera. Do you wish to know what revolutionary art is like? Look at the frescoes of Rivera. Come a little closer and you will see clearly enough gashes and spots made by vandals, Catholics, and other reactionaries, including, of course, Stalinists. These cuts and gashes give even greater life to the frescoes. You have before you not simply a painting, an object of passive aesthetic contemplation, but a living part of the class struggle, and it is at the same time a masterpiece. Right, so the idea that the artwork is also a kind of artifact of its time. You know, he's being very literal about it, but also we could say in a broader sense that this is the case, that art bears the struggles of its time. Because it's a fresco, kind of literal character, and it's a public art mural. It's in a space that can be the site of that kind of conflict. All right, so Wilhelm Reich. Ideology as material power. Okay, so he's setting himself the task, he's writing in 1933, and then revised a little bit in 1946 at the end of World War II, of critiquing the Marxism of his time, especially as regards how they understood Nazism as a phenomenon. So the opening paragraph is a little bit opaque and needs unpacking because the point of it can get past you pretty easily. The German revolutionary movement before Hitler was based on the economic and social theory of Karl Marx. An understanding of German fascism therefore presupposes an understanding of Marxism. Okay, so what the hell? So the revolutionary movement before Hitler was dominated by the ideas of Marx. Hitler is a revolutionary. Nazism is a revolutionary movement. So the revolutionary movement went from Marxism to Hitlerian fascism to Nazism. That's really important, meaning Marxism failed in its revolutionary aspiration, and that task was taken up by something else, namely Nazism. Now, why do you have to understand Marxism and its history to understand fascism? Well, Hitler was inspired by Benito Mussolini, who invented fascism as a movement. And who was Benito Mussolini? He was a Marxist. He was a Marxist. He was a socialist. He was a friend and colleague of Rosa Luxemburg and Vladimir Lenin. But he decided during World War I that Marxism was not revolutionary enough, so he came up with his own new ideology, fascism, which was meant to be more revolutionary than Marxism. And one of the ways that Mussolini said that Marxism was not revolutionary enough was that it didn't give enough scope to the subjective side of politics, to the subjective impulse in humanity. So this is a tricky proposition. So fascism was meant to be a more profound movement, more spiritual, more subjectively satisfying, and also more practically effective in leading the masses than Marxism was able to be. So Marxism was seen as too passive, too objectivistic. And indeed, Reich is saying, Wilhelm Reich is saying, that could be true with regard to vulgar Marxism. So Mussolini turned against Marxism, and indeed he got his start politically putting down the workers' uprising in Italy at the end of World War I. And that led him to taking power. So, who's Wilhelm Reich, our author? So he is a member of the Communist Party, he's a Marxist, he's also a practicing psychoanalytic therapist. And I think also a psychiatrist, also trained as a psychiatrist. And he's trained in Freudian psychoanalysis by Freud himself. So he's a direct follower of Freud. And at this time, Freudianism is not approved of by Marxists. So social democrats and communists don't like Freud. Why? Because they think that Freud is an irrationalist, and that too concerned with the subjective aspect of mental life. But Reich is going to draw a parallel between Marx and Freud, between Marxism and a kind of Freudian approach, as we'll see. And it's on this question of ideology. And it's on this question of the subjective and the objective. So what this is not exactly a fusion of Freudianism and Marxism. It's rather a Marxist appropriation of Freud, especially with regard to recovering what he calls the subjective factor of history. So what would a Marxist appropriation of Freud look like? It would look like a Marxist appropriation of Freud as descriptive of psychology. But psychology in a specific sense, psychology in capitalism. Meaning Freud himself thought of his view of psychology and of mental illness as being more transhistorical in character, whereas Marxists like Reich and others like Benjamin, Adorno, the Frankfurt School, we'll see, follows this direction charted by Reich. They understand the specific dynamics of psychology that Freud described as being peculiar to capitalism. So what is Freud? Because we're not really going to have time to get much into Freud here. But some little Freudian themes will come up later in our further readings, so it bears talking about now. So Freud is most well known for what's called the sexual theory of neuroses. The idea that neurotic symptoms have a repressed sexual content motivating them. In fact, though, that's a kind of a pop distortion of Freud. What he really has is a neurotic theory of sexuality. So not a sexual theory of neuroses, but a neurotic theory of sexuality. In other words, that humans develop sexually in a socialized context that makes them neurotic. But really what Freud considered his most profound discovery was the conflict of the conscious and the unconscious in the mental process. So the split and conflict between the conscious and the unconscious. In other words, he thought that his great discovery was discovering that human psychology as a product of socialization is self-contradictory. Self-contradictory. And neuroses are manifestations of that internal conflict. So what is the Marxist interpretation of this? The Marxist interpretation of this, and we had a little indication of it from Trotsky already, social contradictions inevitably become personal contradictions. Meaning, the conflict between the conscious and the unconscious is where the contradiction of capitalism shows up within the individual psyche. Okay, so what is that about? And that's where we get, I have this chart that I provided you guys, because Reich is using some language that we're going to encounter in further readings that we didn't have yet in the Marx readings we did, the 1844 manuscripts and the Communist Manifesto. It is there, however, in the phenomenon of reification with Lukács, and then also in Trotsky with Literature and Revolution. That's the base and superstructure idea. The socioeconomic base and the ideological superstructure. And we'll see this is the beginning of Benjamin's work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction that we'll read later in the course. The idea is this. So it's not that the socioeconomic base determines the ideological superstructure. It's not that social being determines consciousness, although actually Marx uses that phrase. But rather, the real issue is how they're contradictory. And how does that contradiction manifest itself? Through a temporal and historical disparity. So the phrase is that the ideological superstructure changes more slowly than the socioeconomic base. Meaning the socioeconomic base runs ahead of the ideological superstructure. So ideology is lagging behind and is conservative with respect to the socioeconomic base. That is a translation into other terms of how Marx described capitalism. So Marx described capitalism as the contradiction of bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production. All right, so what does that mean? So bourgeois social relations we've talked about are the social relations of the commodity, use value and exchange value, the use value and exchange value of labor, labor as a commodity. All right, so the social relations, this is how the social relations of labor characterize our relations to each other, between people, also our relations to nature, and our relations to ourselves. And remember that for Marx, capitalism expresses a contradiction and an alienation of all those relations. So we're in a contradictory relationship with each other, with nature, with ourselves, and that is also our alienation from our relations to each other, from our relations to nature, and from our relations to ourselves. Why and how is that the case? Because the industrial forces of production have burst the bounds of the bourgeois social relations. But it's the contradiction that's important. We could also say the objective and the subjective. So an easy way to describe this, it's fortuitous that we're discussing this in the United States, and also a year before the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. So the American Revolution, unlike France, the French Republic, the Fifth Republic, right? They had their first republic overthrown by the Bourbon Restoration, and then they had a second republic overthrown by the Second Empire, and then they had a third republic overthrown by the Nazis and the Vichy, the French fascists, and then they had a fourth republic after World War II, and then de Gaulle overthrew the fourth republic, and they have a fifth republic. There's one republic in the United States, and it goes all the way back to 1776. So we have a constitution, we have a Bill of Rights, we have a Declaration of Independence based on the bourgeois Enlightenment and revolution of the 18th century. But we also have, after the Industrial Revolution, a social reality of capitalism. So we have two overlying realities. We have an 18th century reality of bourgeois revolution, and we have a 19th century reality of industrialization, and they are in conflict. They're in conflict. So subjectively, we still live in the 18th century according to bourgeois values: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, all equal in their inalienable rights. Liberty, equality, fraternity. Jefferson also wrote in the French Declaration of the Rights of Human Being and Citizen. Those are our values, practically and theoretically. Subjectively, that's what we think we're doing. But in reality, we're living in an industrial capitalist society. So objectively, it's quite different from inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all equal, liberty, equality, fraternity. All right, so our objective reality contradicts our subjective reality. And our subjective reality is stuck in the 18th century, and our objective reality is the 19th century, capitalism. It's only recently, I should point out, that people have embraced capitalism as a positive term. It's basically only from the 70s. From in the 1970s, and a little bit before that in the mid-20th century. That basically people rejected calling this society capitalist because they thought that was a Marxist, pejorative, tendentious view of things. They're like, this isn't capitalism, it's a free market, it's liberal democracy. So to even call it capitalist was seen as being a Marxist. But then in the context of the Cold War, then people were like, hell yeah, we're capitalist. We're not communist, we're capitalist. So it's like a bizarre thing that happened, which is that people embrace the term capitalism as a positive thing it's not meant to be. Right, so basically, this society doesn't really acknowledge itself as capitalist. It acknowledges itself as bourgeois. It's liberal democracy, free markets, individual liberty, representative government, government of, by, and for the people. No, it's a capitalist state of capitalist management over proletarian reality. Objective, subjective. So our consciousness is bourgeois, our social being is capitalist. Our practice and theory are bourgeois, our historical conditions are capitalist. So what we were talking about in the first half of class, we still do things like art. We do think that we're all little Leonardo da Vinci's, but no, we're capitalist worker drones. Objectively. Subjectively, Da Vinci, objectively capitalist worker drone. Okay. So, contradiction, social relations and forces of production. Contradiction of ideological superstructure, socioeconomic base. Contradiction, consciousness and social being, etc. And that has a temporal and historical character. So how does that line up with Freud? Freud characterized the conflict within the psyche as the conflict between the past and the present. So the idea is that in our childhood, we're raised by our parents according to values that they got from their parents, who got it from their parents, and that we're raised not according to the conscious values of our parents, but their unconscious values, which are actually the values of the great-grandparents. And yet, the reality that we have to deal with, the reality principle of present reality, contradicts those values that we were raised with.
Mysticism technically line two, like is that something that would be of the same like inherited trait from parents?
Right, so the mysticism is that we misrecognize. So this is another point of contact between Freud and Marx. So the idea is that we see reality as we wish it to be. So reality is a kind of an ideology, therefore. Consciousness is really a function of a kind of wish fulfillment for Freud and for Marx of ideology. So what does that mean? It means we live objectively in this techno-whatever industrial capitalist hell, but we wish that it were otherwise. So we still think, oh, it's the Bill of Rights and the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the French Revolution and the Enlightenment.
Okay, so
Right?
mysticism is used, it means like positive thinking. You're still hoping for like a positive outcome out of the Marxist ideas that are being applied. You're kind of just ignoring out like what's rather than fascism.
Well, so the fascism is a mystical consciousness, according to Reich, but in this Freudian sense of that wish can also have a negative character. So the dream can also be a nightmare, meaning that there's a deep ambivalence, especially in like deep psychology, so like very early childhood. That means that everything that it has one value has its opposite value at the same time. So love and hate we talked about with Hamza Walker. Deep ambivalence, the coexistence. How that usually shows up is consciously you feel one thing, unconsciously you feel another thing. So everything that you consciously love, you unconsciously hate. Everything that you consciously hate, you unconsciously love. Everything that you're consciously attracted to, you're unconsciously repelled by. Everything that you consciously enjoy, unconsciously you're disgusted by, and those things can flip. So what the fascists do, and this is the tricky part, is that they, in their anti-capitalism, because they are anti-capitalist, but they call capitalism like the Jewish principle that is in conflict with the Aryan principle. So they want to return Germany back to like pre-Christian paganism, like Aryan tribalism. That was their vision. They wanted to get rid of, they were anti-Christian, anti-capitalist, anti-bourgeois. Goebbels said when they took power, now we will begin to undo 1789. The values of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity. Vichy France, they changed the motto on the coins and on the money from liberty, equality, and fraternity to family, country, and faith, or something. Like, it's like total, right? So, but in reality, what did they, according to Reich, what did they really want? What they really wanted was to restore Germany to pre-World War I. They really wanted to go back to before German society went into deep crisis. So they wanted to go back to a kind of petty bourgeois, like kind of more optimistic, kind of liberal capitalist world before it was shattered by World War I and by the threat of communism and socialism, which they associated with capitalism. So they have a kind of exaggerated fantasy version of a desire, and then they also have this strange exaggerated fear of the world that they live in. So they're against capitalism, yes, sure, except they misrecognize capitalism as bourgeois values. And so they appear to be more radically anti-capitalist than Marxists are. Why? Because Marxism is actually based on bourgeois values, on like liberty, equality, fraternity, inalienable rights, restoration of the rights of labor. The Nazis are very cynical about that. That's why they put over the concentration camp entrance, work will make you free, because that's actually the bourgeois ethos. The bourgeois ethos is, if you want freedom, you have to struggle for it and earn it, work will make you free. Right? It's very Protestant work ethic. And so they were like, yeah, work will make you free. We will work you to death. That's how you will be free. But it's a very deliberate, if kind of an enactment, to use psychoanalytic language, a kind of enactment of this kind of bizarre negative fantasy of the reality that they were living. That's what he meant by mysticism. So the issue is, what is the reason for the apparent irrational? Right? So the social democrats and the communists, the Marxists, were like, oh, Nazism is irrational. What they're calling for is impossible. And the masses will never follow that, because the masses will be driven by their material interests. So they'll make like a reasoned decision on the basis of their material interests. And Reich is like, yeah, it doesn't work like that. Right? That's not how things really work. So vulgar Marxism for Reich means thinking that people will act almost mechanically according to their objective interests. And yet he says, in reality, oppressed people don't rebel and hungry people don't steal to eat. And why don't oppressed people rebel and hungry people steal to eat? Because they think it's wrong to do such things, right? They're under the spell of ideology or psychology, however you want to put it. I will say also that Freud had written a few years before Reich wrote a book called Civilization and Its Discontents, and in that he described the dynamics of revolution, and how he described the dynamics of revolution because he was around socialists and Marxists. He didn't agree with Marxism, but he was very much aware of it, and he was agnostic as to the Soviet Union. He was like, maybe it will work, maybe it won't work, I don't know. But what he said was the masses don't rise up out of opposition to the dominant values. The masses rise up when they feel that the dominant values have been betrayed by the ruling class. Meaning, it's when the ruling class is exposed as going against the values of society that they supposedly embody and champion, that's when the masses rise up. So the masses rise up in the name of restoring the common sense values of society against the betrayal by the ruling class. So the ruling class delegitimates itself when it betrays the common values of society. And what are those common values? Bourgeois values. But what are bourgeois values? Work, labor, the rights of labor, the dignity of work, everybody being treated fairly, everyone being treated as a contributing, productive member of society, participating, getting along, peaceful commerce. Right? So when the ruling class is shown to betray those values, that's when the people rise up. Because obviously, it's not like some counterculture is going to like convert the masses into some radical ideology. No, that's never going to happen. So consciousness, common sense, the values and theory and practice of everyday life are bourgeois. But the ruling class is forced by the objective conditions of capitalism to violate those values. And when they do so, they risk the people rising up against them. Like, no, we don't want some techno-feudal capitalism. We don't want Elon Musk turning us into worker drones. Hell no. We want 1776. Go back to the values of the American Revolution. Right? That's the whole Trumpian thing. We don't want to be ruled by Silicon Valley. No. The Democrats are subjecting us to internet censorship. They're not allowing us to make our own medical decisions about COVID. They're doing it in the name of Big Pharma. Right? We're being controlled. Our rights are being contravened. So, you get the reactionary bourgeois Trumpian rebellion. Not at all fascist, because the fascists were completely whack jobs. It's completely whack jobs in a way that it's hard for us to appreciate. At the same time, why did people vote for the Nazis? They didn't vote for the whack job ideology. They voted for a kind of conservatism. They voted for a kind of return to the old situation. They didn't really want to take Germany back to Aryan insanity, tribal madness, no. Very few people wanted that. But the leadership claimed to want to do that. Right? So that's important to keep in mind. So it's somewhat different. And also Germany is different. The history is different than the United States. It's peculiar. All right, so that's in large measure what he's trying to get at here. Now, because he does an analysis of the voting in 1933, and what he finds is that it was the younger, poorer, more insecure working class who voted for the Nazis. And not even the majority of them did so. But insofar as the working class got behind the Nazis in the vote at all, it was not the employed, secure, well-paid male working class. Those still voted for the communists and the socialists. It was the women and the young people and the unemployed and the poor people and the precarious people who voted for the Nazis. In other words, it was the most exploited and the most oppressed who voted for the Nazis. So we have this kind of 60s idea that the most oppressed are the most revolutionary. No, that's not what Marxism thought. No, never thought that. And also that youth movements are revolutionary. They're not. They tend to be reactionary. So up to that point, up until the 60s, youth movements were always like deeply reactionary. So fascism was a youth movement. There were nationalist movements, like hyper-nationalist movements in the 1800s, youth movements. So yeah, we have these prejudices coming out of the 60s that young people are more revolutionary and progressive. No. They tend to be more infantile and reductive and want to return things in some fantasy scenario to what they imagine was a better condition. Generally speaking, that's been the case. How that functions today is a little different. Because again, he thinks like Marxists thought. So Marxists included in material well-being things like sexual satisfaction. So I mentioned that the Marxists supported decriminalizing deviant sexuality, giving people reproductive power over themselves, liberal laws as regard to marriage and divorce, gender equality. Why? Because they realize that that's part of material life and freedom. That's part of material well-being and emancipation. And sexuality is part of that. It's not something other than the commodity money economy. It's bound up with it. Okay. So he says, to understand why the sex economy considers the authoritarian family the most important place of reproduction of the authoritarian system, and authoritarianism is understood here as, in Freudian terms, it's the power of the superego over the ego. So it's an unconscious, internalized authority from childhood that constrains what the ego allows itself to do, and to feel even. Think. So it's the introjected authority of the parental figures that then is transferred onto more general social authority. As one grows up, one sees one's parents as just ordinary human beings rather than as godlike figures, and so that kind of authority presence is transferred to larger, more abstract symbols. So he says, in order to see this, we have only to take the example of a conservative worker's wife. Her economic situation is the same as that of the revolutionary workers, but she votes fascist. The difference between the sexual ideology of the average revolutionary and the average reactionary woman is decisive. The anti-sexual moralistic structure of the conservative woman makes it impossible for her to develop a consciousness of her social position. It ties her to the church as much as it makes her afraid of sexual Bolshevism. Theoretically, the situation is the following. The mechanistically thinking vulgar Marxist assumes that the consciousness of the social position would be most acute when economic misery is sharpened by the additional sexual misery. If that were so, the masses of women and of adolescents would be far more rebellious than the men. The exact opposite is true, however, which the economist is at a loss to understand. He will not understand why the reactionary woman does not even want to listen to the economic program. The answer is the following. The suppression of the gratification of primitive material needs has a result different from that of the suppression of the gratification of sexual needs. The former incites rebellion. The latter, however, by repressing the sexual needs and by becoming anchored as moralistic defense, paralyzes the rebellion against either kind of suppression. More than that, the inhibition of rebellion itself is unconscious. The conscious mind of the average unpolitical individual does not even show a trace of it. The result of this process is fear of freedom. This is a very important idea. Fear of freedom. Fear of freedom. And a conservative reactionary mentality. Sexual repression aids political reaction not only through this process, which makes the mass individual passive and unpolitical, but also by creating in his structure an interest in actively supporting the authoritarian order. The suppression of natural sexual gratification leads to various kinds of substitute gratifications. Natural aggression, for example, becomes brutal sadism, which then is an essential mass psychological factor in imperialistic wars. To take another example, the mass psychological effect of militarism is essentially libidinous. The sexual effect of a uniform and of rhythmically perfect parades, of military exhibitionism in general, are obvious to the average servant girl, even though they may not be obvious to the learned political scientists. Political reaction, however, makes conscious use of these sexual interests. Not only does it create peacock-like uniforms for the men, it uses attractive women in its recruiting campaigns. One only has to remember the recruiting posters with text like this: if you want to see the world, join the Royal Navy. The faraway world is represented by exotic women. Why are such posters effective? Because our youth, as a result of sexual suppression, is sex-starved. Sexual moralism, which inhibits the will for freedom, as well as those forces which tend in the direction of authoritarian interests, derive their energy from repressed sexuality. Now we understand the basic element of the retroaction of ideology on the economic base. Sexual inhibition alters the structure of the economically suppressed individual in such a manner that he thinks, feels, and acts against his own material interests. This is the mass psychological explanation and confirmation of Lenin's observation in the Soldiers' Rebellion of 1905. To the unconscious of these soldiers, the officers represented their fathers, who denied their sexuality and whom one was not allowed to kill, even though they destroyed one's joy in life. Their hesitation and repentance after having seized power were the expression of their hatred turned into its opposite, into neurotic sympathy. Thus, the hatred could not be translated into action. The practical problem of mass psychology, then, is that of activating the passive majority of the population, which always carries political reaction to victory, and the elimination of the inhibitions which counteract the will to freedom as it is generated by the socioeconomic position. If the psychic energies of the average mass of people watching a football game or a musical comedy could be diverted into the rational channels of the freedom movement, they would become invincible. This is the standpoint which guides the following sex economic investigation. This is the first chapter of a longer book. The book is The Mass Psychology of Fascism. The chapter is Ideology as a Material Power. All right, so let's unpack that a bit. Right, so the idea is that objectively, the industrial forces of production is a revolutionary society. Objectively, people are in a revolutionary situation. Subjectively, they're in a conservative reactionary position. And it's that contradiction that's important. And that shows up within the individual as the psychological phenomenon of the unconscious repression of the will to freedom. So, ideology critique. So we did immanent dialectical critique of phenomena, ideology critique, and psychoanalytic therapy have a meeting point, because what psychoanalytic theory does is that it works through the subjective experience of the patient. It works through their own consciousness and discovers the conflicts within. So it discovers the self-contradiction that's showing up in the subjective experience of the individual. In the same way, the ideology critique, or the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena of Marxism, is also looking at like manifest, conscious, subjective appearances of things, and looking at the motivation and also the internal conflict to see how it might point beyond. So for Freud, you cure the neurosis by working through the neurosis. You don't like get around it or try to eliminate it. You have to work through it in its own terms. In the same way, the Marxist critique of ideology is that one cannot just sort of eliminate the subjective ideology and just have the expression of objective reality, but one has to work through and in and through the contradictions of the subjective reality. And so there's kind of an analogy being drawn here. Now the mysticism point, commodity fetishism, I think we've touched on that previously. That commodity fetishism is not a merely psychological subjective phenomenon, but is more of a practical objective reality. And yet it would make contact with this idea of the fantasy reality of how Freud understands psychology. All right, so, but again, it's not the Freudian substitute gratification, but it still is concerned with the subjective reality that actually conditions how we act in the world. So it has a practical character. So to say that ideology is a material force is to say that it affects what people do practically. Meaning no one acts directly on their objective interest. They always do so through their subjective interest. And if there is a conflict between the objective interest and the subjective interest, that might be inherent in the situation in capitalism. In other words, that may not be able to eliminate it. That basically the vulgar Marxists want people to act objectively and just sort of disregard their subjectivity, but that will never happen. That will never happen. And also, what would that even mean? Right? What would it mean for people to adapt to the objective condition of the industrial forces of production? That's the sort of dystopia that we were looking at earlier.
How would you have to accept this revolution that would be the solution? Because
Even the revolution is a distortion, yes.
You would think if you're following proper Marxism without knowing you're being idealist that a revolution occurred, but what revolution?
Was it? Right. Exactly. Now this is the thing, so there's no getting around misrecognition. And this is a little bit of a Hegelian point, which is that every recognition is actually a misrecognition, and every misrecognition is also a recognition. So the idea is the truth in ideology or the truth in the neurotic symptom. Right? So Freud, the way Freud dealt with neurosis, he said, well, of course, you can treat the patient as just deluded. But you can't just snap them out of it, right? You can't just say, oh, you're deluded, look at objective reality, it's at odds with your subjective reality. No, you have to deal with people at the level of their subjective reality. But also, everyone is in a subjective reality. So the other point of Freud is that the way Freud understood therapy was that, of course, the therapist is also living through their subjective fantasy. Meaning it's not as if the therapist has an objective view of things, no. So it's really about the interrelationship between the patient and the therapist, which is a mutual fantasy that they're both participating in. And it's also based, Freud understood, it's based on the fact that the patient, more or less consciously, but largely unconsciously, sees the therapist as like a parent-like figure. And so wants the therapist to sort of approve of them, and nurture them, and fix them, and cure them, and love them, even though that's not possible, right? And so the therapist has to deal with the fact that whatever they do, they're implicated in the delusion or the fantasy reality of the patient, and that they themselves are bringing their own psychology into it unconsciously, right? Whether they are aware of it or not. And so the therapist just needs to be aware of the fact that they're engaged in an enactment with the patient. Similarly, Marxism is not some kind of objective view of reality. Marxism is an ideology too. Marxism is a socialist ideology, a communist ideology, and when we read from Marx, Marx said communism is a dogmatic abstraction, it's one-sided opposition to private property. Marxism is not free of this problem. Meaning Marxism doesn't represent the society of the future, but only the awareness of contradiction in the present. Not shying away from that contradiction, but sort of trying to focus on it. Even then, right, it's doing so subjectively. So it's not as if Marxism is some outside perspective. So this whole idea of scientific socialism, Marxism as scientific socialism, what Marx and Engels meant by that was awareness of their own reality, which is ideological and commodity fetishistic and everything else. It wasn't like a kind of physical or natural, like objective science, which anyway scientists know science is also a subjective thing, right? It's not as if you access objective reality directly. You're always dealing with the way things appear. You're always dealing with distortions that are subjective in nature. And those distortions are not just distortions, they can also be insightful. They can help get at the truth of things. Right. So again, the vulgar Marxism has this kind of layperson's kind of objectivistic, which Lukács last week called reified view of things. Meaning, when we think of science, we think of like contemplating something from outside as if you're not in the practical relation with the object that you're observing. I guess it's known now as the observer effect, the Heisenberg principle, the observer effect in physics. But really it goes back to Kant, which is that we only know the world as it appears to us. There is no objectivity without subjectivity. So Reich was trying to sort of remind people of that and draw the parallels between Freudianism and Marxism on the score of having to work through the way things subjectively appear. There is no other way to proceed. Right, it's not like you can step out of subjective reality, you can't. All right, we went a little bit late. All right, good. So we will come back next week with Krakow and Benjamin on mass culture and photography.